The dawn of October 25, 1944, rose pale and quiet over the Philippine Sea. To the west, the island of Samar still slept under layers of mist and low cloud. The sea itself seemed at peace, a long, gray plain rolling gently beneath a humid sky. On that calm morning, no one aboard the small destroyer USS Johnston yet knew that before noon, the calm would vanish into chaos, and they would face one of the largest and most overwhelming enemy fleets ever assembled. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, sleek, narrow, and built for speed. Her hull stretched barely 376 feet, her guns only 5 in number, her armor thin enough to be pierced by a rifle round. She carried nothing that could stop a battleship's shell, and she was never meant to. Destroyers were the fleet's greyhounds, built to scout, to screen carriers, to dart in and strike with torpedoes, and to vanish before the enemy could aim. But that morning off Samar, she would not run. At her helm was Commander Ernest E. a man known for energy that seemed to radiate from his bones. Half Cherokee, half white, Evans carried himself with a restless fire that burned through every order he gave. At the Johnston's commissioning ceremony a year earlier, he had promised his crew that their ship would be a fighting ship, that he intended to take her into battle and would never run from an enemy. "If you don't want to go along with me," he had said, "you'd better get off now." No one had. Now, in the soft gray of pre-dawn, Evans stood on the bridge, binoculars raised toward the horizon. The Johnston was part of Task Unit 77.4-3, Taffy 3, a group of small escort carriers and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Their mission was simple: provide air cover for the landing troops on Light Island. To the north and south, 2 other similar groups, Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, patrolled in loose formation. None expected to fight a major surface battle. The Japanese fleet, they believed, had been shattered days earlier at the Sibian Sea, but the sea, that morning, held a secret, hidden by rain squalls and distance. Steaming eastward at full speed was the Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a massive armada of 23 ships, including the battleships Yamato and Nagato, 8 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a fleet built to crush anything in its path, and it was headed straight for the lightly armed escort carriers of Taffy 3. At 6:37 a.m., lookouts aboard the Johnston saw the first glint of sunlight on the horizon, metal, and far too much of it. Within minutes, radar confirmed what the eyes already feared: contacts, multiple, closing fast. The Johnston's radar officer reported large returns. Bearing 300, Evans turned toward the horizon, his jaw tightening. He knew what it meant, and he knew what he was going to do. The Johnston had entered service barely a year earlier. In October 1943, she was one of 175 destroyers of the Fletcher class, the backbone of the wartime U.S. Navy, fast, agile, and bristling with guns. She could deliver torpedoes with deadly precision and then vanish behind a smokescreen before the enemy could react. But what made her exceptional wasn't her hardware. It was her captain. Ernest Evans was, by every account, the kind of leader sailors both feared and loved. He was direct, unsentimental, and fiercely loyal. He knew every name aboard his ship, every weakness in his men, every potential fault line in their training. When he drilled them, he drove them to exhaustion. When he praised them, it was short and honest. He wanted a crew that could think under fire, move without panic, and fight even when logic said it was impossible. The Johnston's crew had learned to read Evans's moods by the set of his shoulders and the tone of his voice. When he was calm, they were confident. When his energy sharpened, they knew a fight was coming. In the months leading up to Light, Johnston had seen plenty of action, shelling beachheads, escorting carriers, rescuing downed pilots, but she had never faced an enemy surface fleet. Destroyer battles had become rare. Air power ruled the Pacific now. Most of her crew believed the era of big gun duels was over. They were wrong. At 6:47 a.m. on October 25th, the horizon erupted in flashes. Great columns of water rose hundreds of feet into the air, the telltale signature of Japanese battleship fire. The enemy had opened up at a range of more than 18 miles. Shells larger than cars arched through the clouds toward the tiny shapes of the American carriers. Evans watched the first salvo land in the water off their port bow. The next came closer. He didn't wait for orders. He couldn't. The Johnston's engines roared to full. Evans shouted a single command: General Quarters. All hands, man your battle stations. Within seconds, the ship came alive, alarms wailing, boots pounding on steel decks, hatches slamming shut. The crew raced to their guns, strapped into flak jackets, and braced for the impossible. Ahead of them, 6 escort carriers began launching every plane they had. Wildcats and Avengers roared off the decks, carrying bombs and depth charges, anything that could be turned into a weapon. They were aircraft meant to hunt submarines, not fight battleships, but they went anyway. The Johnston surged forward through her own smoke, spray flying across her deck. Evans's plan was madness or genius. He wasn't going to defend. He was going to attack. Commence torpedo run, he ordered. At 6:58 a.m., Johnston broke from the screen and turned straight toward the advancing Japanese fleet. Behind her, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 were already throwing up smoke screens, trying to hide in clouds of white vapor that drifted low across the sea. The other destroyers, Hull and Heermann, followed suit, forming a thin, desperate shield between the carriers and the incoming giants. But Johnston moved first. Evans's decision was instinctive, the kind born not from calculation, but from the gut of a man who refused to watch others die while he had a gun to fire. He knew that if the Japanese reached the escort carriers, the result would be massacre. The carriers had almost no armor, and their planes were already gone, clawing into the sky without enough fuel or bombs to stop what was coming. So Johnston would fight alone if she had to. At 7:03 a.m., Evans shouted, "Open fire." The 5 5-inch guns began barking in perfect rhythm. Their shells, no bigger than coffee cans compared to the monstrous 18-inch rounds of the Yamato, arched out toward the nearest target, a Japanese cruiser more than 9 miles away. Range, 17,000 yards. Bearing steady, shouted the fire control officer. "Keep firing," Evans ordered. The Johnston's guns spat flame and thunder. Each shot felt like defiance made solid, a steel protest hurled against the horizon. The first salvos fell short, pluming in white water. The next began to hit. Observers saw flashes on the side of a cruiser, Kumano. One shell tore into her bow, blowing open steel plating and flooding her forward magazines. The massive ship slowed, veering out of line. Evans seized the moment, commenced torpedo attack. Johnston accelerated to flank speed, 36 knots, the turbines howling as the sea sprayed across the bow. She dashed in and out of her own smoke, zigzagging through shell splashes that rained like steel rain. All around, geysers rose from the sea as the Japanese battleships adjusted their aim. The destroyer seemed impossibly small, a flicker of motion darting through chaos. At 7:10 a.m., when Johnston had closed the range to just over 10,000 yards, Evans gave the order, "Fire torpedoes." 10 bright white wakes streaked away, spreading across the water like the claws of a hunting cat. Moments later, two detonations thundered through the mist. Kumano shuddered, her bow nearly severed. The great cruiser fell out of formation, burning and listing. Cheers erupted across Johnston's deck. For a heartbeat, victory seemed possible, but then the horizon answered back. Dozens of Japanese guns locked onto Johnston. The sky tore open with light. The first shell, an 8-inch round from a heavy cruiser, slammed into the destroyer's starboard side, just below the bridge. The explosion ripped through her forward compartments, shredding metal and men alike. The ship shuddered, smoke pouring from the wound. The number 1 gun went silent. Communications to the bridge flickered, then cut. Evans, his face smeared with soot, shouted through the chaos, "Engine room, full power. Keep her alive." Below decks, Sailors fought fires in choking smoke. Others dragged the wounded to what little shelter they could find. The air reeked of oil and burning paint, but no one-stop dot at 7:20. The Johnston emerged from the smoke again, limping, battered, but still moving. Evans turned her broadside toward another cruiser, Haguro, and resumed firing. Observers from the nearby carrier Gambier Bay later swore they saw the destroyer's guns blazing, even as flames climbed her superstructure. They said it looked like a wolf snarling against a pack of lions. At 7:35 a.m., Evans saw Hull and Heermann charging in from the south. The destroyers formed a ragged line, three gray shapes against an armada of steel. Their goal was not survival, it was time. Every minute they bought was another minute for the carriers to escape, close the range. Evans ordered. Shells crashed around them, shredding antennas, tearing holes in the deck. One round blew away the bridge wing, nearly hurling Evans overboard. He climbed back, blood streaking his face, and barked new orders as if nothing had happened. For nearly an hour, Johnston fought a duel that should have lasted seconds. She poured every shell she had into the Japanese cruisers, switching targets, dodging, counterattacking. Her gun crews worked with mechanical precision, feeding shells from ammunition lockers even as fire burned through the deck plates. When the aft magazine flooded, sailors formed a human chain to carry shells by hand. When the rangefinder was destroyed, gunners aimed by eye. Keep hitting them. Evans shouted over the roar. Don't let them through. At 8:10 a.m., Johnston's radar went dark. Power flickered. Another shell tore through the main engine room. Her speed fell to 17 knots. Still, she fought. Even the Japanese were stunned. Admiral Kurita himself, aboard Yamato, watched the tiny ship attacking through the smoke. His officers were incredulous. A destroyer, one of them said, charging battleships. Kurita could only nod. They are brave men, he replied quietly. By 8:20 a.m., the sea round Johnston was a cauldron. Every direction spat fire. Shell splashes clawed higher than masts. Each plume threw salt and steel across the deck. The air trembled with the concussion of Yamato's main guns. 18-inch shells that landed close enough to rock the destroyer sideways. Evans wiped oil from his eyes and scanned the horizon. The white smears of smoke that hid Taffy 3 were thinning. Through the gaps, he could see the escort carriers limping south. Flight decks loaded with half-armed aircraft that had been recalled in haste. He knew what that meant. Every second he kept the enemy's eyes on Johnston was another heartbeat of survival. For the flat tops, bring us about, he ordered. Rudder response was sluggish. The helmsman fought the wheel, shouting over the shriek of metal on metal. Johnston came around slowly, presenting her port side, her remaining guns, to the nearest cruiser. Chikai, the gunners fired as soon as they could see through the haze. The first salvos walked up Chakai's deck, striking a secondary turret and starting a fire. But the reply came instantly. A dozen 8-inch shells hammered Johnston. 2 struck amidships. 1 sheared off the last functional radar mast. The destroyer's silhouette shrank beneath a new column of black smoke. Down below, in the engineering spaces, men waded through waist-deep water. Steam lines hissed like serpents. A machinist's mate slapped a valve shut with his bare hand, the skin searing off on contact. They fought not to win, but to give the ship 10 more minutes of life. Evans refused to yield. He turned to his executive officer. Tell the gunners to keep firing until the barrels melt. By 8:35, the Johnston had lost steering. Evans ordered manual control. A team in the aft steering compartment would now turn the rudder by hand. Even crippled, she kept moving. She was bleeding oil and fire, but she was still a threat. The Japanese shifted their aim to Hull and Heermann, but Johnston stayed in the fight, trading blows with ships 20 times her size. When the destroyer Yukikaze appeared through the smoke, Evans took the chance to close once more. Target that destroyer, range 6,000 yards. The guns answered. At such short range, the duel was brutal and fast. Both ships scored hits. Both were burning. Then Johnston shuddered again, a torpedo struck her port side. The blast ripped open compartments from the engine room to the mess deck. She began to list, slowly, stubbornly refusing to roll over at 8:50. The Battle of Samar had reached its fever pitch. The ocean was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks. The sky rained fragments of twisted metal. And still, Johnston's guns barked, each shot weaker than the last, but still defiant. Witnesses aboard Heermann later said it looked as if the sea itself refused to let the destroyer sink. Every wave lifted her higher, as though the ocean honored her fight. By 9 a.m., Johnston was nearly dead. Her speed had dropped to 5 knots. Electrical power was gone. Only one gun remained operational, Mount 53 at the stern, firing on manual control. Evans moved aft along the wrecked deck. He limped, a fragment had torn into his leg, but he would not sit down. The surviving crewmen turned as he passed, faces streaked with soot, eyes raw from smoke. He stopped near the aft gun. "Boys," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "we've done all we can. Keep firing as long as you can see the enemy." The gun crew nodded. They fired another shell, then another. The weapons recoiled nearly through them from the deck. The deck itself was slick with oil and blood. A moment later, Japanese cruisers closed to within 3 miles. They fired again. The salvo struck amidships, blowing a hole clean through the superstructure. Evans shouted for the wounded to be brought topside. Men began to abandon ship. Some hesitated, refusing to leave until the captain did. But Evans stayed. Radio operators transmitted a final message: "Enemy ships closing. We are going down fighting." At 9:45 a.m., Johnston rolled slowly to port. Evans ordered, "All hands abandon ship." He was last seen on the fantail, helping a wounded sailor into the water. Moments later, the destroyer slipped beneath the waves. The survivors clung to rafts and floating debris. The sea was calm now, almost eerily so. Behind them, the Japanese fleet began to withdraw. Admiral Kurita, shaken by the ferocity of the American defense, had turned back. The tiny escorts of Taffy 3 had beaten him off. The price had been unbearable. Hull and Samuel B. Roberts were gone. Dozens of planes and hundreds of men lost. But the impossible had happened. A handful of light ships had stopped an entire battle line. Hours later, survivors watched as the sun set behind a blood-red horizon. In the fading light, oil glistened on the waves like black glass. Someone whispered, "The skipper made them pay." Evans was never found. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation would read that he fought his ship gallantly until she could fight no more. For decades, the Johnston lay undiscovered, resting more than 20,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. In 2021, a deep submergence expedition located her, still upright, guns pointing toward the surface, hull scarred but intact. On the video feed, the letters JOHNSTON were clear on the bow. It looked less like a grave and more like a challenge, a reminder of what courage could do against impossible odds. Engineers who studied her wreck noted the same thing naval historians had said for years. The destroyer's final maneuvers showed perfect control, perfect training, and a will beyond reason. Every generation of sailors who reads her story finds the same lesson, that technology, armor, and tonnage can be measured, but spirit cannot. It is the human element, the unbreakable refusal to yield, that shapes history at sea. And so the name Johnston lives on, whispered on the decks of destroyers that came after her. She was small, but she fought like a fleet. She went down fighting, and in doing so, became immortal. The sea grew quiet after the storm of fire. By late morning on October 25, 1944, the men of Johnston drifted in small groups across an empty ocean, surrounded by oil slicks and debris. Their destroyer, once a streak of motion and fury, now rested deep below. 20,000 feet beneath their feet, the survivors clung to rafts, planks, and life vests. Oil coated their faces and uniforms. Many were wounded. Some were blind from burns or flash exposure. The tropical sun began to rise higher, turning the sea into a mirror of heat. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, gathered a handful of men around a damaged life raft. He tore pieces of cloth to bandage wounds, sharing what little water they had. No one spoke for a long time. Then, quietly, someone whispered, "Did we stop them?" Hagen nodded. "We stopped them." The men looked toward the horizon. There was no enemy now, only the soft roll of the Philippine Sea, indifferent and endless. Hours passed. Planes from the surviving escort carriers occasionally flew overhead, searching for life among the wreckage. Each time, the men waved their arms or flashlights, their hope rising with the drone of engines, only to watch the aircraft fade again into distance. By afternoon, dehydration began to set in. The salt water burned their lips. Some men slipped quietly beneath the surface, too weak to keep their heads up. Sharks circled in the oily water. Still, they held on. Just before sunset, a group of Filipino fishermen appeared on the horizon, outriggers moving cautiously among the wrecks. They spotted the survivors and began pulling them aboard. Others were rescued by patrol planes and landing craft the next day. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Most had been in the water for more than 40 hours before rescue. When news reached the fleet, even battle-hardened sailors were stunned. A single destroyer, barely 2,000 tons of steel, had charged an entire battle line of the Imperial Japanese Navy and lived long enough to wound it. The story spread quickly, passed from ship to ship, from sailor to sailor. The men of Taffy 3 had done what no one thought possible. They had turned away the storm. In the aftermath of the battle off Samar, naval engineers and historians faced an uncomfortable truth. The Navy's smallest, lightest warships had performed with greater effectiveness and greater bravery than many of its capital ships. Reports from the surviving officers of Johnston, Hull, and Heermann were poured over for months. What they revealed wasn't just courage, it was adaptability, instinct, and design ingenuity. Destroyers like Johnston were designed for speed, not endurance, but their maneuverability, shallow draft, and fast acceleration allowed them to weave through shellfire and deliver torpedo strikes with almost surgical precision. In many ways, their combat at Samar became a study in asymmetric warfare. Small, agile vessels exploiting confusion, smoke, and proximity to defeat a superior force. Naval architects took note. Future destroyers and frigates would inherit lessons from that day. The importance of flexible command structure, the integration of radar and fire control systems for rapid decision-making, and above all, the principle that survivability was as much about agility as about armor. In the years after the war, as the United States entered the Cold War era, these lessons shaped new generations of warships, from the Forrest Sherman class to the guided missile destroyers of the Spruance and Arleigh Burke lines. Echoes of Johnston's spirit lived in their design. Engineers who had studied the Samar reports often quoted Evans's words as a kind of mantra. "We're going in." It was the essence of decisive command, a reminder that in battle, the cost of hesitation could outweigh the risk of action. But Johnston's influence was more than technical. It was moral. She had become a legend in naval academies, a case study in leadership under impossible pressure. Cadets read about the captain who fought until his ship sank beneath him, a man whose courage became the measure of duty. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, one instructor began his lectures with a simple statement: "If you ever doubt what a destroyer can do, remember the Johnston." For decades, the ocean kept her secret. Johnston's location remained unknown. Her final resting place somewhere in the depths of the Philippine Trench, beyond the reach of any diver. In 2019, a private expedition led by Victor Vesovo, a former Navy officer turned deep-sea explorer, began searching for her using a submersible capable of reaching 20,000 feet. After days of scanning sonar returns, they found what looked like the outline of a destroyer's bow. On March 31, 2021, cameras confirmed it. There she was, upright, mostly intact, guns still trained toward the surface, as if waiting for another order to fire. Even the hull number, 557 was visible through layers of sediment. For the first time in nearly 80 years, the Johnston was seen again. The footage spread quickly across the world. Naval veterans, historians, and descendants of her crew watched with awe. In the grainy black and white feed, they could see the past made real again. The steel bones of a ship that had refused to surrender. At a memorial ceremony held aboard a modern destroyer in Pearl Harbor, sailors stood in silence as the images of Johnston appeared on a screen. A wreath was cast into the sea. A voice recited the names of the fallen. Then, as the last note of taps faded, the commanding officer spoke softly. She fought bigger ships, and she won. We remember her not because she sank, but because she never gave up. The battle off Samar remains one of the most studied naval engagements in history, not just for its tactics, but for its sheer improbability. How a handful of escort carriers and destroyers turned away an entire Japanese fleet remains a testament to the unpredictable power of human resolve. Every generation rediscovers Johnston in its own way. For some, it's a story of innovation, a study in what small, fast ships could achieve through precision and daring. For others, it's about leadership, the way Ernest Evans embodied the kind of courage that cannot be taught, only revealed. But to those who go to sea, Johnston represents something deeper. She is the embodiment of the destroyer's creed, to protect others, to charge the impossible, to never retreat while others are in danger. Her guns may be silent now, but her echo still travels through the hulls of the ships that followed. Every time a sailor steps onto the deck of a modern destroyer, feeling the vibration of turbines, the hum of steel underfoot, they are walking in the shadow of ships like Johnston. It is said that the sea forgets nothing. The waves that closed over Johnston in 1944 still carry her name, whispered in the wind over the Pacific. Somewhere in that endless blue, her captain still stands at his station, watching the horizon, waiting for the next fight that will never come. And perhaps that is her truest legacy, not victory, not survival, but the eternal proof that courage alone can defy destiny.